Now. Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this special program on Humanity Rising, a 12-day program that we're convening with over 400 partnering organizations from around the world at this time when the world is gathering in Glasgow for the Conference of Parties, COP26, which has been called the most important COP in its 26-year history, because we are now, from a climate point of view, in code red. We'll have a lot to discuss about this today and over the next 12 days. We want to start today by anchoring ourselves, rooting ourselves in the ancestors, by remembering to the primordial past, who we most essentially are, and the journey that we have traversed as a species over millions and hundreds of thousands of years to get to now, at this moment. To give us our invocation, we've invited Apila Colorado, an elder in the Iroquois and Celtic nations, who's been with us for many, many years, and to whom we turn to open our sacred space when we gather in council for matters of gravity and import. Apila?
Ancestors, Mother Earth, or just Yahweh. The door opens to remembrance and renewal. With this sacred rattle rock, fashioned by your own hands, through Mississippi alluvial delta soil, we hear your voice. Mother Earth, soft you rattled this morning. All the colors of the powers of life are within you. Let each of these colors awaken in us on this call around the world, heart to heart, embracing you, Onondaga Mother Earth. The leaders of our world have the opportunity to lead, to heal, to renew. The voices of you, your children, your paths, your teachings, waters, wind, soil, the fire of life. We give thanks for the creative beings, the holders of the heavens, the pillars of life. All life systems listen now. Your voice we long for. Your voice, the one that brings us home, a grandmother's lullaby, a mother's love, a father's fierce family protection, those beings put in motion, brought into creation so long ago, we acknowledge and give thanks for. Blessings for the world's beings, for the leaders at COP26, that the miracle of renewal, regeneration manifests. Ah, Mama, Ua Noa. All my relations.
Thank you, Apila. As we begin, everyone, let us, in the spirit of remembering, recall that it was in 1965 when the first scientists brought to the attention of President Johnson in Washington their concern about climate change. He listened to them very politely and then put the report in a drawer, never to be heard of again. Let us remember in 1972, when the Club of Rome and scientists from MIT issued another report saying that climate change was the most critical issue in the history of humanity. And we had about 50 years to solve it. And if we didn't solve it by the first quarter of the 21st century, we would experience catastrophic effects and possibly the extinction of the human race. The governments did nothing. Let us recall, I believe it was in 1982 when Bill Mckibben wrote the first op-ed in the LA Times to the public, warning about climate change. Let us remember the first sustainability conference in Rio de Janeiro 50 years ago next year, where the world for the first time began to grapple with sustainability. But yet the governments did essentially nothing. And the corporations, unfettered, exploited the environment. Let us remember in 1996, there was such pressure that the governments began to think at least they should talk about it in an organized way. And they met in Berlin for the first conference of parties under the influence of climate scientists headed by Rajendra Pachauri and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was formed to give regular reports to the world public, to the scientific community, to our representatives in government. And yet still, very little was done. Let us remember all the efforts of the climate movement, the progressive movement over the years to protest, to offer solutions, to engage in all manner of activity, to wake a sleeping public up, preoccupied mostly with consumerism in the lethargy of worn out democratic cultural politics. And then let us remember just very recently, over the last several months, when climate scientists are now saying incontrovertibly that we are now in the tipping point. According to the World Wildlife Fund, having wiped out 2/3 of the biodiversity on the planet over the last 50 years, we're now in the tipping point. Escalating ecological turbulence is no longer avoidable. The last report of the IPCC in August stated clearly that we are now in unprecedented territory, which the Secretary General of the United Nations said means that we're now in code red for humanity, which essentially means that in the face of the rising ecological turbulence, our governments are less and less capable of ensuring any kind of meaningful stability. And so the time frame for us to do something is radically diminished. What we could have done at our leisure 50 years ago now must be done on an urgent, accelerated basis if it's to be done at all. And the options that we are confronted by are stark, both in terms of the gravity of the crisis and in terms of the radical solutions that now need to be implemented within a time frame that is not to our liking. When you're dealing with nearly 8 billion people on this planet, how we turn this thing around is the question of the hour. And that's why Humanity Rising and all the people and the organizations that are gathered here for this 12-day program that we're broadcasting around the world. This may be one of those moments like 9/11, like historical events that change history, where we are all being called to account. We are now in the day of reckoning. And it has come to the point, I believe, where the people of the world, not so much the governments, not so much the corporations with whom we've been pleading for decades, but it's now come down to what do we, the people, do in the face of code red? How do we come together? How do we comport ourselves, those of us that we're going to hear from who are in Glasgow, and those of us who we're going to hear from around the world? What kind of synthesis can we forge in 12 days that will enable us to come out of the other side of the COP with a higher level strategic formation and unity and impact that can make the kind of difference we so desperately seek? So it's in that spirit of both gravity and desperate hope that we convene these 12 days, and thank all of you for joining us in whatever capacity you will join. And we're going to have a double helix over 12 days. We're going to hear every day from people in Glasgow who will be just dropping in. We'll be hearing from people around the world according to certain themes that we'll be hearing from later on in the program. And as people come in from Glasgow, we will interrupt this program for a special announcement, as we all know happens frequently on TV. But we want to weave a conversation, everyone, among all of us that will empower us in such a way that we can move into a new era of unity amongst the movement and effectiveness in the corridors of power. We want to begin with, I would say, two elders in our movement who've helped inspire and shape the conversation for many, many decades. We'll hear first from Vandana Shiva, who you all know, who's been the author of numerous books, who took on Monsanto and kept them out of India, who's been at the forefront of the globalization movement, who's inspired people worldwide with the fierceness of her intelligence and the passion of her heart for the kind of social change that will birth a new civilization. And then we're going to hear from Bill Mckibben, another elder, who, as I indicated, was one of the first people to bring to public attention the crisis of climate change. You know, it's an irony about climate change. It's the most urgent crisis we've ever felt, but as Barack Obama has so aptly put it, we're the first generation to really know about it. And we're also the last generation to be able to do anything about it. And that's been the message of Bill Mckibben for 40 years. So we're going to hear from Vandana and then Bill, and then we're going to enter into the flow of all the other equally important diversified voices. But we wanted to really frame this with Vandana and Bill today as we begin our 12 days in the spirit of the ancestors, in the spirit of the elders, in the spirit of remembering the depth of the wisdom that we carry in our beings, which, if activated in the right way, can lead us on the pathway of renewal and regeneration at this moment. So thank you, everyone. And I turn the program now over to Vandana. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you, Appella, for that beautiful invocation to Mother Earth. And I think part of the climate problem is we forgot Mother Earth. We forgot that she is living. She is the elder. She created her climate over billions of years. And just 200,000 years, she allowed us to emerge as a species, to join our other relatives who are much older than us. The plants, the microbes have been around much longer and have a deeper knowledge and intelligence of how to live as the earth, in the earth, with the earth. Not only have we had a very short memory about our very existence, and it's been truncated even more, because we often forget we're just 200,000 years old as a species. We then forget that we are just 500 years of the ability to conquer and colonize. A sad 200 years of a fossil mistake, of first driving colonialism. The British Empire ran on coal, and then the American Empire based on oil. That these short mistakes are not our evolutionary potential. They are not our evolutionary future. James Lovelock, working with Lynn Margulis, realized that the earth was a living, self-regulating system that had created her climate. They had created the conditions for us to evolve and sustain ourselves as long as we did it in partnership with our other relatives, in partnership with the biosphere. In the last 4 billion years of the Earth's life, the sun has heated 30%, and yet the Earth has cooled. She was 98% carbon dioxide without life, and then she gave birth to life. The photosynthetic capacity of microbes and then the plants and the green leaves. It is the technology that I have dedicated my life to learning and working with. And it's the technology that doesn't even occur in the discussions of either the climate discussions or very often even the biodiversity discussions. The biodiversity discussions are being taking us back into assuming that the earth is dead matter, just assets to be manipulated, monetized, financialized, extracted. So through photosynthesis, the power of the leaf to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with the energy of the sun, limitless energy of the sun, and convert it into carbohydrates, the living molecule, and give us oxygen to breathe. And do all of this with ever-growing potential of abundance. So without life, Lovelock's calculations show that she was 98% carbon dioxide. And with life, it was reduced to 0.03%. The temperatures without life were 290 degrees, plus minus 50. And the average was reduced to 13. 4,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide was brought down to 270. And from being a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere that was heating, we inherited an oxygen-rich atmosphere, and that's the cooling. Now, if we look at that scale of our ancestor as the Earth, and then we realize that the big climate denial is of the living Earth, of terra madre, and the reduction of terra madre to terra nullius, the empty Earth, empty of human beings, because after all, those colonized people, the indigenous people, the wisdom that we just received from Appella, they're not fully human because they don't conquer. They're not violent. They're not colonizing. And from this has not only grown the early destruction, as Amitabh Ghosh has written so beautifully, the terraforming began before fossil fuels, destruction of forests, conquest of land, uprooting of people. But the 200 years of the fossil mistake created a hubris of how we think. I call it the fossilized mind, the fossilized mechanical mind. And taking systems of production and reducing them to industrial systems. And Gandhi was amazing in how he recognized this in his little book written in 1906. That's why he pulled out the spinning wheel. He said those satanic mills of Lancashire and Manchester have locked the planet into slavery. We can only break free when we work with a light ecological footprint. And that is the challenge. The hubris of fossil fuels and industrialism is now playing out in false solutions. And I've just done a paper on the living Earth and climate change based on plants, planet, and people, beginning with the living Earth and her processes of cooling that we can learn from while we meet our needs in abundance, in sharing, not competing in scarcity, but cooperating for a thriving of all beings. The first is the aggression of thinking, if we've messed up the climate, let's mess it up more with geoengineering and climate engineering. And the Sami, the indigenous people of Sweden, have worked to stop the experiment of Harvard and Gates for geoengineering. And there's a movement, hands off Mother Earth. Stop tampering with the climate. Second, big talk in COP26 on carbon capture. Now, I remember 20, 30 years ago, I was in Berlin for the Green Week, and that was dedicated to soil. And I talked about soil, not oil, which is the subject of my book that I wrote before Copenhagen, that the future lies in the soil, in the living earth, in the biosphere. The future does not lie in oil, which should be left under the soil. And the Secretary of State of the US was there, and they said, in 20 years' time, we will have carbon capture. I said, the earth has it today, and ecological agriculture has it today. Indigenous people have it today, and have had it for millennia. Otherwise, how could it be that now, 2021, 85% of the biodiversity of the planet is in the little bit of 20% of the land left in the hands of indigenous people? They are the teachers of how to live with the living earth in living economies. The second, so it's geoengineering, carbon capture, very clumsy, crude technology. The living carbon capture of the leaf gives us food and oxygen and water, in addition with healing the cycle of carbon. And this other carbon capture is so energy intensive, it's actually going to create new problems. Because every external energy use is an entropy creating system. Every living system that generates its own energy is a negative entropy system, as Schrodinger so brilliantly put it in his little book called What is Life? The third, I've ended up having to look at food for the last 40 years because of the violence of the chemicals, the fossil fuels, and beginning with Punjab, when I wrote my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution. And when I wrote Soil Not Oil, I put all the elements of an industrialized, globalized food system, the industrial inputs, the chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, the herbicides, their manufacture, and their emissions. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more damaging to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. But then, and when you commodify food, you don't have a limit to the appetite. So you invade into the Amazon for GMO soya, into Indonesian forests for palm oil, into Congo for palm oil. And this invasion is a big reason for the emerging infectious diseases and pandemics. But it is also 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And then you take good food, which we could eat fresh from our gardens, lovely carrots and lettuce and salads, and you reduce it all to 4 crops: corn, canola, cotton, and soya. And then you transform it into more energy intensive, more ultra processed food, which is responsible for 75% of the chronic diseases people are suffering from. But this energy input, the long food miles of transporting food in long distance supply chains, which can be disrupted. Look at what's happening to England right now with the disruption of the supply chains and the food system. Packaging. I worked with indigenous people in India who are fighting bauxite mining. Most of the bauxite today is going for aluminium for food packaging. Plastics. My country was a junk-free culture 30 years ago. You just see mountains of plastic and aluminium everywhere. And it's all from the junk food culture. Add all that, that's another 20%. And then because you're privileging, the fossil mechanical mind privileges uniformity. The earth privileges diversity and gives rise to diversity. The fossil system is dependent on external inputs of chemicals, fossil fuels, energy. The ecological systems generate their own energy and actually hold it together in negative entropy systems so that you have more when you grow the life rather than less. One little seed gives rise to the trees. That negative entropy process is the miracle that inspires me on a daily basis. But the worst, which is getting so much coverage, is this new cooked up idea of net zero. Net zero is we won't stop pollution. By 2050, we will find new tricks of accounting. We will find new colonization to capture the land, the forests, as carbon sinks and displace the indigenous people. If you look at many of the recipes for nature-based solutions, it is about removing people from their land, removing pastoralists from pastures, removing farmers from farmlands, and they are the solution, as our work in Nabdania has shown so clearly. And this new colonization will be counted to remove on the accounting system the pollution. Now, when the Earth Summit started, 92, and we created the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the principle that was clearly written was the polluter must pay. Till today, the polluters have not paid. They've been dangling 100 million in terms of climate finance. Just now, a new article has come out. India suffers 87 billion average per year. We've just lost 77 people in my region because of untimely rain and floods and landslides. In February, with glacial lake burst and flooding and maldevelopment, we lost 200. 2013, we lost 20,000. Cyclones are making life difficult. And the Arabian Sea, which never had cyclones, has had cyclone Totke. So these extreme weathers, IPCC, the sixth report that led to the code red, is actually now a journalist's report. It's basically giving a report of what we are living through. And when you go back to the early parts, the first report said emissions resulting from human activities will lead to a 0.3 degree increase in 100 years and a 65 centimeter increase in the year 2100. We are not talking of 100 years from now. We will be extinct if we continue on this path. The IPCC said if we don't change in the next, I think that's an amazing echo of don't change if we don't change. So how do we change? Working in harmony with the earth, gratitude to her for giving each species of space, a commitment to her that we will not violate her ecological laws and her ecological limits. We will work according to her potential to grow more life so that we can solve the problem of hunger, we can solve the problem of disease, we can ensure that everyone has a secure home and most of humanity will not be living under blue plastic tents as climate refugees. Most importantly, scientifically, it's now proven that we need, if we leave the oil underground and stop the emissions, which is what Bill will do, if all of the world's land was lived with on the patterns of the earth, with ecological farming, regenerative agriculture, regenerative grasslands, regenerated forests, we actually need only 30 gigatons of drawdown, but the potential from ecological agriculture of taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, maximizing photosynthesis, intensifying biodiversity, more plants together, every leaf capturing the sunlight. We grow plants for harvesting the sunlight. Industry grows plants for taking up more chemicals. This is what I've had to study, sadly, over so long, and they call it high yielding. We actually have the potential to draw down 180, 200 gigatons per year. So time now is to really say, Mother Earth, we apologize. We come back to you. We will now work under your instruction. And the big alliance that you talked about, Jim, the indigenous people are already leading. Women are already leading. The youth are already leading. The youth, I sometimes wish, would join in the regeneration as much. When I met Greta in Paris, I said, Greta, strike on the Fridays. The rest of the week, grow gardens. And that's what our work has to be. A civil disobedience when that's necessary, but also a beautiful regeneration of self-organization from the tiniest molecule and cell and microbe and plant to communities and humanity as a whole. That to me is humanity rising and the earth rising.
Thank you, Vandana. Very, very important statement of the crisis and the opportunity that is before us. We'll circle back to discuss it as the program unfolds. And we want to now hear from Bill Mckibben. Most of you know Bill from his writings and the fact that he founded 350.org. That was founded at a time, as he'll tell you, when 350 was the upper limit beyond which we could not go. And I think as of last week, we're at 415, 420 and rising of parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Bill is in Glasgow, arrived just yesterday. So Bill, turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you very much. My old friend Vandana has done all the hard work and laid out the context in the biggest, most universal terms. So let me just say a few words about where we are this week, this month, this year, to give it a little bit of even more up to date, of even more of immediate context. So these talks in Glasgow are important, as any time the world comes together is important, but I wouldn't expect extraordinary results out of here. It's a move along the road that we're on, which is going so far much too slowly. So let's set the context here a little bit. This is the most important of the climate meetings since Paris 6 years ago. And Paris 6 years ago, though far from perfect, did manage to have the world's countries make some fairly basic agreements about what they were going to aim for. And what they were going to aim for was a temperature increase on this planet of below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 degrees centigrade as possible. That's not a good thing. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we're fools to find out what 1.5 does, but we're going to find out because there's an immense amount of momentum in this system. The trouble is that the agreements that people made in Paris, the pledges that countries put forward, didn't actually get us anywhere near that 1.5 degrees. The world's still on a target to warm about 3 degrees Celsius. And if anything like that happens, then we won't have civilizations anything like the ones we're used to. It's too much violent, chaotic flux. The UN High Commission on Refugees indicates that a world of unchecked global warming could produce 1 billion climate refugees this century. The economists predict now that unchecked climate change would do damage of about $551 trillion by the end of the century, which is more money than there is on planet Earth. And, that's just a small way of saying life as we know it wouldn't be happening on a world with that much change. And so the push has been on since Paris to try and get everybody to go faster and agree to do more. And the hope was that this meeting here, already postponed a year by the pandemic, would be the session at which people would make those agreements. It doesn't look like we're going to get huge commitments, new commitments out of most countries in that count anyway in this go round. And that was really sort of signaled in a sense by the quite sedate speech that Joe Biden gave just before Vandana started talking. Biden's speech to the COP was fairly subdued, and the reason is that he wasn't able to come here with the legislative coup that he'd been hoping for. His plan was to get the US Congress to back him on a plan that would have basically forced utilities to grow their renewable energy output by 4% a year. But big oil's man in the Democratic Party, Senator Manchin of West Virginia, managed to block that. And so he comes with a much weaker hand to play, and therefore much harder to put significant pressure on the other big player here, China, which for its own internal political reasons seems not to want to be making big commitments either. Other huge players like India are yet to be fully heard from. Some players aren't coming at all: China, Brazil, Russia. None of that should be taken as as too dire a signal exactly, because there was never any hope that this was going to be the forum at which we solved the problems that we faced. It's one more step along a long and difficult and perhaps, we don't know, impossible process. But I think that there'll be some clarifying things that come out of Glasgow that'll be important for the movement to understand and build on. And for me, always the most important thing about these COPs is not the actual agreements that come out of them, but the fact that it's a place for much of the climate movement to get together and think about what comes next. Um, I think as we go through this Glasgow cycle, that the world's governments will have mostly shot their wad on political action for the next few years. And I think that means that the action will switch for a while from a heavy concentration on politics and government to a heavy concentration on the other lever that's big enough that it might actually change the course of our societies. There are two of those levers. One is marked politics. For the last little while, we've been pulling on it just as hard as we can because this COP was coming up, because we had crucial elections in countries like the US. In the next period, I think we're going to be pulling as hard as we can on the lever marked money or finance or capital, because that's the other force in our society big enough to potentially divert us from the destruction to which we are otherwise headed. We've, of course, been working with this a good deal already over the past few years. Many of you have been involved in this divestment campaign, which has become the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. I was able to write in the Times last week that we're at $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested from fossil fuel. And even since that's happened, the fifth biggest pension fund in the world, for instance, joined in the last couple of days. That's enough money that it's crimped the power of the fossil fuel industry, not completely, witness Joe Manchin, but substantially, in that for the first time, Congress seems likely to pass something, even if it's not what we'd hoped for, but will be significant climate legislation. And that campaign and those efforts are going to, I think, continue and expand dramatically and focus more and more on banks, asset managers, and insurance companies, the people who provide the pipeline of money that keeps the fossil fuel industry afloat. You know, if we're in the kind of emergency that everyone says we are, and believe me, we are, then every business and every person needs to be making some changes. And really the ones that we're asking of the finance industry aren't that big. Chase Bank is the biggest lender in the world to the fossil fuel industry, but it's only about 5% of their business, if that. So stopping lending to those guys would not make them significantly less over-rich than they are already. And so we'll be pressing hard on that. Before I got on the plane here, I was in Boston with a group of young people and a group of older people outside the Chase Bank in downtown Boston. The young people have been leading this movement, and happily, older people are now joining in. You see the third act on my shirt here. That's the name of this new effort that some of us are putting together to get people over the age of 60 backing up as best we can the young people who were leading these movements. Greta and Vanessa Nakate and all the other youth leaders are incredibly powerful, but it's not okay to ask high school students to solve the biggest crisis the world ever faced by themselves. They need the rest of us, in part because when we take on banks and things, bankers are well aware whose money they've got. 70% of the financial assets in America are in the boomers and the pockets of the boomers and the silent generation. 5% are in the hands of millennials. So if we're going to make this push, then we need everybody involved and working hard. Our job here is, taken as a whole, not impossible. The price of renewable energy has fallen 90% in the last decade. That's a significant, really world-altering shift in a lot of ways. And it means there isn't a technical or financial obstacle to replacing burning things on the surface of the earth, to relying on the fact that there's a burning ball of gas 90 million miles away and we have the wits to make use of it. The political obstacles remain, and the fact that we have to move as fast as we do is the wild card here, the thing that makes things very difficult indeed. But that's the situation we're in. Our job is to act as catalysts to make things happen much faster than they otherwise would. And it's probably the most important job that humans have ever taken on. We don't know what the outcome will be. Dr. King used to end his speeches by saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This may take a while, but we're going to win. Well, the arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And we better win soon. Winning slowly on climate change is a different way of losing. So we've got extraordinary work to do in the few years ahead. And it depends above all on our ability to build movements big enough that they balance and then break the power of the fossil fuel industry to determine the future. We need to determine the future. And that's why we build movements. Last night I'll just end by saying, was very beautiful here. We had a wonderful big concert with Patti Smith, many of the youth leaders speaking. Mohammed Nasheed, the president of the Maldives, spoke, having survived an assassination attempt earlier this year, 22 hours of surgery. But there he was back on his feet and looking chipper and demanding action to protect his low-lying nation and all the nations of the world. And that gave me a certain bounce in my step today, even in the kind of gloomy gray that is Glasgow. So here we are. It's not the best possible place, but it's not an impossible one either. And our work is cut out for us, and we need to keep resolutely at it. That's how it seems to me anyway.
Thank you, Bill. I think your last line calls it. We're not in the best possible place, but we're not in an impossible place either. And I think the combination of your remarks with Vandana's around just simply returning to biomimicry and remembering the natural systems out of which we came and with which we can build a prosperous global civilization is very wise counsel. And you're so right. There are many of the trends that are going our way. They are somewhat invisible underneath the surface, but nevertheless, change is in motion. So thank you. And thank you, Vandana, for your remarks today as we open this 12-day program. We want to now turn to Rupert Reed. Rupert was one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, more recently of Transformative Adaptation. He's written a number of books and op-eds. And it was really when he wrote a recent blog around the importance of the moderate flank and bringing the direct action and moderate flanks of the climate movement together that we began the dialogue. And I think that's a meta theme for these 12 days is how do we increase the scope of our collaboration at this very critical moment. He was just on trial last week. I think last Friday they got the verdict, Rupert. So welcome to Humanity Rising, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your trial and the outcome and what you have to say there from Glasgow.
Jim, thank you so much. And yeah, I'll say something about my trial in a minute. I'll start out by saying that I agree with what Vandana and Bill have just said so splendidly. And that's good because that provides me a kind of platform from which I can take things even perhaps a little further forward. I'm speaking to you here from the heart of COP26 itself. If it has a heart, that perhaps remains to be seen. I'm in the middle of the blue zone. And if you hear a sort of hubbub behind me, part of that is the speeches of our so-called leaders being beamed and amplified out of the hall, which is just there behind me. I say so-called advisedly because my view, like Bill's, is that it is almost certain that this COP is going to fail us. By that, I don't mean that it will achieve nothing, and I don't mean there won't be an agreement. I think there probably will be an agreement, and the agreement probably will achieve something. but it will not advance us very far beyond Paris. And Paris was already not far enough. So what is to be done? Well, if you're watching this, you're probably among those who are already somewhat turned on or tuned in to this situation. And what that means is that your relationship needs to be perhaps a little bit different to the situation from that of the average citizen. Basically, if you're watching this, you're probably part of a sort of leadership cohort. And what I'm thinking about a lot here at COP is not actually so much what's going on in terms of the details of the agreement that they're trying to iron out here, and not even really particularly trying to influence that agreement to be a bit less bad, although if I can do that, I will. The thing I'm thinking about most of all is making sense to the world, sense making and narrating. This is something we can all do together, what's happening here. So I think it's really crucial. This is a crucial wake-up call, a crucial consciousness-raising opportunity for humanity. What I think is going to happen is that over the next couple of weeks, more people, a huge further cohort of people, will come to understand that our leaders, our so-called leaders, are not really, that they are not planning to save us, that there aren't many adults in the room here, and that, well, it's going to be much more up to us. And I think the most crucial moment here at COP is not probably anything that's going to happen within this arena where I'm sitting talking to you from now. It's going to be what happens when we, the citizens, respond to our so-called leaders at the end. I'm going to be part of that response here on the ground in Glasgow, but wherever you are in the world, you need to be part of that as well. Ideally, physically on the streets perhaps of your state capital or national capital. Obviously, if you're here in the UK, you need to be in London or in Glasgow. But if you can't be in any of those places, then still do your bit through the amazing virtual world that we now all also, of course, inhabit. We need to sense make, we need to narrate. We need to make clear that it isn't 1 minute to midnight, that it isn't midnight, that it's 5 past midnight, that it's already too late to get through this without enormous damage. That the failure of our leaders to date and the likely continued failure on balance of them here in Glasgow means that citizens have to take more of a lead bottom up. There is no alternative. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? That is more true than it has ever been before. That, by the way, is pretty much what we said at my trial last week. 3 of us were on trial for nonviolent direct action against the climate denialists of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, a obscure and opaquely funded group here in the UK who are the leaders of climate denial, if that's the right word, the leaders of climate denial here in this country. And what we did is last year, we poured fake blood over their doorstep to illustrate there is, of course, blood on their hands. And we spray painted lies, lies, lies on the side of their building. And the trial was very instructive. In the trial, we put our point of view very, very strongly using expert witnesses and making clear that we believe we had no alternative but to do what we had done, that it is now so late and still there's climate denial. It's much more than it was, but it's still having an impact in countries like the US and the UK, and that this is completely unacceptable. So we used a necessity defense in court, and the response of the 3 judges was very interesting. They found us guilty, which obviously was regrettable, but they didn't find us anything. They gave us conditional discharges, which mean that in 6 months' time, I'll no longer have a criminal record, provided I'm a good boy between now and then, which will be a challenge, but I'll do my best. They charged us virtually no court fees or court costs. That's very unusual. And most unusual of all, although we were found technically guilty of criminal damage, they charged us only a minority of the cost of that damage. In other words, the larger preponderance of the cost of the damage has to be borne by the climate deniers themselves. Now, if they weren't sending a message by doing that, I don't know what they were doing. So the courts are an interesting and quite lively locale for where this struggle can be pushed forward at the present time. And we definitely need the radical flank in climate activism to carry on doing that. I did this action last year as part of Extinction Rebellion. Bill Mckibben, of course, has done nonviolent direct action and been arrested for it before, as has Jim Hansen. Any of you who are on this call and haven't yet done it, I would say, get your hands dirty. There's no time like the present, and there isn't much longer to wait. There really isn't. We all know that. But as Jim said, what I also think is very important is this: the radical flank in Extinction Rebellion, in the Sunrise Movement in the US, in direct action movements against pipelines and so forth, Ende Gelände in Germany, those risking arrest over recent years. We've moved the agenda, we've pushed the dial, we've changed the debate, we've raised consciousness significantly. And by doing that, we've opened up a much larger space, if you will, behind us, a much larger space for others to move into. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the moderate flank. We need a huge number of people, a much larger number of people even then have been involved, for example, in Fridays for Future, to start to rise up. And a lot of those people, and you may be one of them, a lot of those people are not going to be willing, at least not yet, to risk arrest for this cause. But they may be willing to do more than they have done so far, and they need to be. And I think there are millions of them who are. What would that more be? Well, it might be, for example, work stoppages, short work stoppages, symbolic stoppages. If our children can go on strike for a little while, surely we can too. It might be action in our communities, building resilience, undertaking transformative and indeed deep adaptation on the ground, leading from the bottom up. I think there is going to be a huge pivot to adaptation on the back of this COP failing us, because an awful lot of people who come to understand at this time that our leaders are not riding to our rescue, will come to understand that we need to start to take care of ourselves better in terms of, for example, food growing. So a shift in our communities, a shift in our workplaces, using more radical methods than have been used in the past, but not necessarily going as far as Extinction Rebellion have gone. That is what I mean by the moderate flank. I see humanity rising as potentially part of that moderate flank. I think that the rising up, which I've gestured at here, which I think will begin on or around Friday, November the 12th, in the wake of the failings of this COP, I think that it will include many such people as are on this call and many, many more. I think that it will also include many of those who are impressed by Bill's wonderful idea of the third act, the older generation getting involved, just as the younger generation have led over the past few years. So that would be my key message here. I think that history is about to be made. I don't think it will be made by our leaders here. I think it will be made by the unnamed movement or movement of movements, which I'm trying to call the moderate flank, stepping into the space that has been opened up by Extinction Rebellion et al. Understanding that leadership now needs to pass from our so-called leaders to ourselves, and setting out to transform our civilization such that it doesn't have to collapse. And if it does start to collapse, that collapse as soft a landing as possible. That is the hard reality we are now facing. If we face up to it and face into it, we can make something beautiful and splendid out of it. I think that process begins in earnest the moment COP26 ends.
Thank you, Rupert. Thank you so much. I think the point that you're making about the emergence of a radical and moderate flank in formation with each other is a very illuminating potential goal for all of us to hold at this critical moment, and particularly as we focus beyond the COP. So thank you so much. And Rupert will be coming back every day or two, as will Bill and some of the others that are there in Glasgow. So we'll be hearing more from Rupert over the next days. I want to now turn our attention to a whole different domain. Oftentimes we think about climate change in relationship to governments and corporations and civil society, and we should. But there's the whole domain of religion and institutionalized religion in particular. And so I want to bring on Martin Palmer, who's probably done more than anyone, at least I know about, to work with religions as institutions in this area of environment and conservation. He was the founder of the Alliance for Religion and Conservation with Prince Philip, and they collectively over several decades catalyzed over 1 million projects among the world religions around environmental sensitivity and conservation. More recently, Martin has been a founder of Faith Invest, seeking to channel the massive investment power of religions, again, as institutions, into ecological concern. So Martin, welcome to Humanity Rising, and say a few words about this domain and what takes you to the COP in Glasgow.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. We go back a long time, and I loved your opening about the whole issue of a depth of wisdom. And I do feel that we have within the faith communities, including the indigenous faiths, a huge wisdom that has been sadly ignored. I love the way that Vandana took us through the evolutionary history of how we got here as a planet and as a species. But part of that has been the stories we tell and the way in which we understand who we are and what the rest of creation, evolution, doesn't really matter what you call it, they're all stories, what our place is within that bigger picture. But I want to start with something very simple. We, in the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, we set up a project with UNICEF around their Education for Sustainable Development. So the program that rolls out around the world through school networks in, I think, over 140 countries now. And we were asked if we would work with colleagues in East Africa, Muslim, Christian, and Hindu to develop a faith-based Education for Sustainable Development toolkit for teachers and for pupils. And we had a wonderful Catholic nun from Africa who was in charge of this project for us. And she went to a big gathering of all the Education for Sustainable Development people in Japan a couple of years ago. And she was making her presentation and someone stood up and said, yes, but what's the difference? I mean, seriously, what is the difference between a faith-based Education for Sustainable Development toolkit and the usual one that we produce? And Mary just simply said, we start by saying thank you. And I think that point about gratitude, a point that was made earlier, that sense that actually we should be amazed at what we live in. We should be grateful. It is an abundance. It is a generosity of creation. And the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, the first amongst equals of over 300 million Orthodox Christians, put it very bluntly when he said, and he was one of the first people to come out on the environment after we'd held the event in Assisi in 1986, he said, to destroy anything that is a gift from God is blasphemy. It's that serious. And I had the great privilege, Jim has referenced this, and Jim was involved with this in 1986. Prince Philip invited 5 major religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism, to come to Assisi to meet with the major environmental groups. And this was came out of a project that I'd done with schools. And he asked me if I would coordinate this gathering of the faiths. And we asked each of the faiths to write a very simple statement. You know, what do you actually believe about the rest of the planet, about why we're all here, why it's all here? And we published those, and they have helped change the world, because in 1986, there were 2 religious projects, one Buddhist, one Christian. That was it. As Jim has said, there are now over 1 million. In fact, the UN calculates about 1.5 million faith-based environmental programs. And that's all very exciting. I think we can also claim we're one of the best kept secrets in that people always go, oh my God, you mean the faiths have done something on this? How amazing, I'd never heard of that. But the faiths know that they've done that. We have over 700 different faiths that are engaged in developing environmental programs using their own resources, and doing so not guided by a WWF or a Conservation International or the UN, but guided by actually their own wisdom, their own experience. The fact that Up until about 300 years ago, these are the systems that ran the planet, with many a fault, inquisitions, religious wars, etc. But frankly, nothing as destructive as has been unleashed by ideologies or has been unleashed by industrialization. So there is a great wisdom there, and we build on that, and from that outcome projects. But one of the things that I think most surprised me when we founded ARC, Alliance of Religions Conservation, great name, by the way, if you're dealing with the Abrahamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, ARC, they go, oh yes, Noah, oh, that's a good one. Falls flat as a pancake with the Taoists, the Shinto, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Zoroastrians. But it worked quite well with half the world's population. Though we do work with every major faith tradition, and they do tell different stories, and I'll come back to that very briefly at the end. But one of the things that we discovered was that the faiths genuinely had no idea what they owned. And so we began a whole process which resulted in 2 different editions of a thing called the State of Religion Atlas, in which we actually did an audit of what the faiths owned. And it was astonishing. 50% of all schools, 64% of all schools in sub-Saharan Africa are faith-based, or the faiths have a role in sustaining and in enabling them. In parts of Africa, the number of schools that the faiths are running have grown because states are giving them back to the faiths because the states are not functioning. They're not able to run an education system. About a third of all universities, faith-based. More than a third of all hospital facilities are faith-based and faith-funded. 8% of the habitable surface of the planet is owned outright by faiths, 5% of all commercial forests. Further 15% of the world, including some of the most important biodiverse areas, are sacred. And although they may no longer be owned by the faiths, take China, for example, with its sacred mountains, the fact that they're sacred has kept them protected and continues to protect them to this day. But perhaps the biggest shock was to discover how much the faiths are investors. And the faiths are probably the 4th largest identifiable investing group in the world. The figures, it's almost impossible to state, but in working with some of the major banks, we estimated somewhere between 12 to 18 trillion dollars worth. And Faith Invest came into being to help the faiths take seriously something they had not really taken seriously before, and the world has still not taken seriously. The faiths are stakeholders in the planet. But are they invited to any of the big meetings? The Catholic Church alone runs more schools than the whole of North America. Are they at the G20? Are they here at COP? No. Because we've, in a sense, been through, we're an abused community, particularly the indigenous peoples, but not only. Think about the massive wiping out of faithful people under communism or under fascism or under certain forms of nationalism. So we are, as a community, we are shell-shocked, we're abused. And we've kind of kept quiet, because if we talk about what we've got, you find that governments come and take it away from us. But now that the crisis is upon us, it is a call for every stakeholder to come to the fore and to share what they have. And Bill's spoken about the diversity element within the faiths. They are being one of the leading groups disinvesting. And faith investors come into being to say, fine, that's lovely. Where are you going to put it? We know what you're against. Religions are very good at being against things. We really like sort of turning people off and moralizing, and you shouldn't do this, which is very important because, frankly, very few other people bother. But then where are we going to put it? What's the next step in the journey? And Faith Invest is already working with about $1.5 billion worth of religious investments. We aim to have that up to 10 billion within 5 years to help those faith investors shift their funds into what we call faith consistent investing in environmental and sustainable development. And we have a whole raft of pipelines of projects that are coming through. So the faiths are beginning to take up their stakeholder role on that. They're beginning to take up their stakeholder role on education. And they want to be partners with the rest of civil society. We want to be at the table. We don't want to be the table. We were at the past, there were theocracies, but we want to be at the table, because without us, you're not going to be able to mobilize about 80% of the world's population. And you won't have the resources that you need. The faiths, when people have said to us, how have you got so many faith projects going? We go, well, our capacity is the faiths. If the Taoists of China, which they did 25 years ago, decide that the environment is one of their key issues, they put their time, their money, their resources, their skills into it, to the extent that the Chinese government has actually made them one of the planks of their environmental program, such as it exists. And I want to just finish with two little points, really. Nobody was ever converted by a pie chart. We are not a data species. If we were to meet in Glasgow, I shall be there tomorrow, you wouldn't tell me how much you weigh. You wouldn't tell me how old you are. You wouldn't tell me how many calories you have for breakfast. You'd probably tell me about your family. You'd probably tell me about your journey here. You'd probably tell me about when you were last in Scotland. You'd tell me stories. We are a narrative species. And yet we have relied on data to change our hearts, our minds. Why? There is absolutely no evidence that it works. It's narratives. And I loved Rupert's point about narrating and about this moderate flank. Well, the faiths are your moderate flank, and they're already active, and they would love to be more deeply in partnership with you. But the final thing I would say is, for God's sake, don't give us one more plan. We are bedeviled with the belief that only everybody was a Christian or a Muslim or a Marxist or a capitalist or a Democrat or a Republican or whatever it is, we would all be happy and the world would be fine. No, we know that biodiversity is how, as a Christian, believe God makes evolution work. But if that's how God works through evolution, I think God actually likes diversity of stories, diversity of beliefs. So what we need is not another great narrative. We need to draw upon a pluralism of stories from religious backgrounds, from indigenous backgrounds, from the business community, even from the political world, if they can get out of their little bubble. So let's celebrate the sheer amazing abundance of possible ways forward. And I have to say, I totally agree with what has been said about this COP. We come to it, some of us, with apocalyptic expectations, and some come with utopia. Neither will be fulfilled. Something might move, but in the end, it will only move if we do. And the faiths are there ready to be beside you. And we expect to launch in about 9 months' time in Stockholm, the largest collective movement of faith projects ever launched around the world. And we joyfully hope you will join us. And we confidently expect that this might actually just help make a different kind of tipping point.
Martin, thank you. Thank you so much. A very important point, everyone, about story, and that there's not just one story. We're wanting to honor the plethora of stories out there. So Martin, thank you so much for that. And we look forward to working with you and supporting you in any way as you prepare for your Stockholm meeting next year. So we'll be in touch on that. But thank you for bringing in the power and the importance of religions at this critical moment of choice for humanity. It's worth just mentioning before we transition to the world of science and politics with Alden Meyer that most of the world is religious. The longest lasting institutions in history are religious. And I think Martin is making a very profound point that religions are carrying stories that resonate so deeply within us that we give them our allegiance. And as religions change their story around this moment of deep transformation for humanity and the earth, probably more people will be moved than any pie chart that will come from a government committee on climate change. So thank you, Martin, so much for bringing that to our attention. Now we want to turn to Alden Meyer. He was the Chief Policy Officer for the Union of Concerned Scientists, a body of scientists that grew up originally around nuclear weapons, but then expanded to climate change and other environmental issues. He's been at it, like all the speakers so far, for many decades, and has just this last week given congressional testimony to the US Congress, and now just came out of a meeting there in Glasgow. So Alden, welcome to Humanity Rising, and share with us your thoughts and perspectives.
Thanks a lot, Jim. It's great to be with you. And I am indeed a longtime participant in these climate summits. I've only missed one of them over the last 30 years. Some people might say I'm a serial masochist, but actually I think of myself as an indefatigable optimist. And one of my heroes is one of the main architects of the Paris Agreement, who several of you probably know, Christiana Figueres, who likes to point out that impossible is just an opinion. So that's my belief, and it's why I keep fighting despite the odds. Now, if I look at this sweep over the last 30 years, Glasgow really is a pivot point from a system that has been primarily focused on negotiation of treaties and protocols and agreements and rules and all the nitty-gritty of international diplomacy. And it's one now shifting to the implementation of existing commitments and the need to ratchet them up quickly, because we do have the Paris Agreement. Almost every country in the world is part of it. It's bottom up. It allows countries to put forward their own pledges for what they think they can do and then report on how they're doing with them, but no one is telling them what to do. And I think as we move into this new phase of the international climate regime, it's well past time for us to, just as the saying goes, just do it. And I think that national leaders and ministers and negotiators here in Glasgow need to take a page from the growing number of governors, mayors, business leaders, investments advisors, university presidents, and others who are really taking bold action on climate change and are creating a culture of radical collaboration and learning by doing. And in a process that needs to focus more on generating results on the ground than producing more paper agreements, these so-called non-state actors need to be seen as active partners, not as mere observers. So we came into this COP, though, I think, as others have said, facing a lot of headwinds. Developing countries, international NGOs continue to express frustration that wealthier countries like the US and Europe are still not taking sufficient action to address issues of vaccine apartheid and to enhance global recovery through the G7, the G20, and other multilateral spaces. There's the current global energy crisis in China, India, Europe, the US, with sharp spikes in energy prices, which makes long-term political decisions on climate action much more difficult. But I think it can also be used to reinforce the narrative around the benefits of a diversified clean energy portfolio for building economic resilience. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. Geopolitical tensions, particularly between the US and China, are spilling over into multilateral spaces like the climate summit here in Glasgow. We can see this dynamic at play in recent comments from Chinese officials who have been reacting to calls for China to increase its domestic ambition by calling into question the abilities of countries like the US to fully implement our commitments. And of course, the current sausage-making process that others are referred to in our Congress is making that quite a believable narrative. And that's part of what President Biden is trying to address today. Increased public awareness of climate impacts has been really increased expectations for action, which I think is a good thing. And all the major powers here say they want a successful outcome in Glasgow, but if you look under the hood, there are very different perceptions of what good looks like. And at the same time, the fossil fuel industry and other incumbent forces continue to hold political sway in too many capitals, and many of them are still using that influence to frustrate bold action. Now, I was very heartened today by the high-level opening segment. We saw very powerful statements from David Attenborough, from Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and from others. Those two in particular both spoke truth to power and were crystal clear on what's needed from leaders at this moment of existential crisis. But frankly, there aren't a lot of profiles and courage here among leaders in Glasgow who are willing to take on the forces of short-term profit and business as usual and commit to the transformation of our relationship to the natural world that's needed not just to address the climate crisis, but species loss, poisoning of our air and water, and other symptoms of our collective unconsciousness. As Bill said, we already know that we're going to leave Glasgow at the end of next week with a huge gap between the collective level of ambition in the commitments that countries have put forward under Paris out to 2030 and what's required to, as the UK says, keep 1.5 alive. Leaders have to acknowledge the need for transformational action over the next few years to close this ambition gap, and they need to instruct their ministers here in Glasgow to reach agreement by the end of next week on a process and a set of deadlines to make that happen. And it's not just the emissions gap we have to address. We need much more work to scale up finance, both for mitigation and adaptation for developing countries. We already know that sums much greater than the $100 billion a year that developed countries are struggling to meet are required if we're going to help developing countries like India, Indonesia, South Africa, and others make that transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy resources. So we need, in particular, the UK, US, and other G7 countries show how the Build Back Better for the World initiative that they launched at the G7 summit in June is going to deliver clean infrastructure investments at the scale needed. And so far, we really haven't seen those signals. As others have said, all too many countries and communities are suffering from a range of devastating climate impacts. And it's important to note that those are going to continue to mount over the next several decades, even if we succeed in meeting the Paris Agreement temperature limitation goals. In fact, even if we succeeded in getting to net zero tomorrow, because of past emissions and inertia in the climate system, we're going to see devastating impacts for a while. So vulnerable countries need help to address the economic losses and the damage to lives and livelihoods they're experiencing. And the good news is the UK is conducting pretty intensive negotiations with countries on this issue, but I've watched this play out over the last decade or so, and the US and other developed countries are very concerned about being held accountable or liable for our past emissions. And we're not talking millions or billions or even tens of billions of dollars here. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars that's going to be needed each year to meet these goals. And it's not clear how we're going to get to an agreement by the end of next week by Glasgow that really starts to meet those needs. Now, I think as you all know, climate change and health issues were the two driving themes for the G20 Leaders Summit that took place in Rome over this past weekend, just before leaders came into Glasgow. And Italy's Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, I give him a lot of credit. He succeeded in getting the other G20 leaders to agree on the need for more ambitious action in this decade, which was a good thing. Not specific, not as detailed as we need, but the right political impulse. But he was not able to get any clear commitments to phase down coal consumption and to eliminate subsidies for fossil fuel production and use. And I was there in Pittsburgh in 2009 when President Obama hosted the G20 and got G20 leaders to commit to phase out those subsidies for fossil fuel production and use, which constitute over $500 billion a year still. And very little progress has been made on that front. It's absurd. We're saying this is an existential crisis, and yet we're paying people to put out more of the pollution that's driving the crisis. It's just insanity. There also wasn't as much boldness as we needed from the leaders in Rome on transforming our finance systems to shift investments away from fossil fuels at the scale and the pace that's needed. I mean, this is a huge system change we need. Our whole relationship, economic relationship, and relationship with money and who controls it. Now, let me just end here by talking a little bit about what could happen at the end of next week. You probably know that the renowned Danish physicist Niels Bohr said that prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future, but I'm going to foolishly attempt to lay out a few scenarios of what could happen. I think a good outcome here would see agreement on the need for much greater action over the next few years to address the ambition gaps and reduce emissions, to increase climate finance, to deal with loss and damage, and a clear roadmap of how they're going to move forward coming out of Glasgow. We would see in the market mechanism rules and the transparency framework that's being negotiated, environmental integrity would be prioritized. And also we'd see the slew of announcements that governments and companies and investors are making over the next 2 weeks on sectoral initiatives, sending strong signals on the irreversibility of the shift from fossil fuels to a clean energy economy. So that's kind of the happy face outcome. A more middling or disappointing outcome would see no agreement on ways to close the ambition gap, and there would be agreement on the rules for markets and transparency, but with major compromises that could weaken their effectiveness and raise concerns about environmental integrity. And then, of course, there's the ugly outcome, which would see no real engagement at all on ways to close the various ambition gap, and rather sharp divisions and finger pointing between countries over who needs to do more, and really a blame casting kind of mode. But regardless of which of those outcomes we see, the good news is that I think over the last 2 years, we've really seen climate change positioned as a top tier geopolitical issue for world leaders. As I said, it was the dominant issue at the G20 summit, not security, not nuclear weapons, not the economic crisis. COVID was there, and the vaccines crisis, but climate change really dominated the negotiations. And I think that provides a foundation for progress next year and beyond, but it's not going to be easy work. So let me just end with a personal reflection. I think over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll see competing narratives at play. There'll be one narrative that'll emphasize the progress we've made since Paris, the falling prices of clean technologies, the growing number of countries and non-state actors making transformational climate commitments, and that's all well and true. But there is also another narrative which is credible, which will focus on the failure to get even close to where the science requires us to be to secure a tolerable future for current and future generations, that will focus on the lack of a meaningful response to the devastating impacts that climate change is happening on vulnerable countries and communities. And of course, as you all know, the paradox is that each of these narratives contains elements of truth. And it's certainly possible to embrace both of them simultaneously. And I think what we need is a mix of equanimity, realism, and respect for expressions of both grief and hope at these times. Because not to be hopeful saps our energies and our agency, but not to be filled with grief means that we're blocking ourselves from acknowledging the reality of what we're doing to the natural world. And I would love to explore with all of you today and over the coming couple of weeks how we can hold both of these emotions at once and draw on their power to fuel our work rather than feeling like we need to make a false choice between them. I know I've struggled with this tension in my more than 4 decades of fighting for environmental and social justice, and I imagine a number of you have as well. So thanks, Jim, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alden. And you're so right. We have to hold both opposites now simultaneously and allow both the yin and the yang, the fear and the hope, the concern and the optimism to inform our attitudes and actions, because both are true. As someone has said, the world is getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. And it's our capacity to hold that in a dialectical tension that is really at the heart of the framing that we need to embrace. So thank you very much for that. And your notion from Christiana Figueres that impossible is just an opinion. That's a great line. Thank you for bringing it in. Now we want to turn everyone to more of a grassroots perspective from Dita Bizozo, who lives in Edinburgh actually and is going to be commuting to the COP each day. She's a citizen activist, she's a farmer, she's a rewilder. She's part of an NGO called Grassroots to Global. And she's offered to be one of our commentators along with Alden and Bill and Rupert, Martin, and others over the course of the next 12 days who are going to be there in Glasgow. So, Dita, welcome, and share with us any perspectives you might have.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm still pinching myself to make sure that I'm awake, and this is not a dream of sharing this panel with such amazing people that have been an inspiration for me for a very long time. So yes, thanks for this opportunity. And I love the way that Alden finished that, bringing this idea of that we need to hold our grief and our hope at the same time. This is basically the work I do at the moment when I'm not running around in trains, is to look at grief tending and to offer spaces where we can actually touch that place in us that is so scared and isolated from the pain of the world. That I think it's what's fueling a lot of the separation and greed that to some degree is making all these targets so difficult to reach. And this is not the truth, that's how I see it. So I came to be here through the soil. I'm a farmer, and I really believe in the regeneration of life. Like Vandana was saying at the beginning, we have that technology, the earth has that technology to create life, to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make it into food and beauty and air. And it's there. I think the solution is actually, or one solution is actually quite simple. It's just about soil regeneration. But something is stopping us from doing that. Something is preventing us from actually allowing people to have access to land. And that's where I wanted to dedicate my life to. And then I soon realized that part of that block lies in the way that we've been separated from the land, from seeing ourselves as part of nature. So that's how I came to work with soul regeneration and with grief tending, and with trying to offer spaces, safe spaces where people can break their hearts, and break their hearts in a way that really allows us to touch that place where we can feel how we are part of this Mother Earth that we can't really control, but we can interact with in a beautiful way that doesn't lead to us suffering or the earth suffering. So that's kind of my overall vision. And for me, this is not about the climate, it's about when we say, like we heard today, that, you know, we are past that tipping point and there's a lot of horror coming our way. There's a lot of horror happening right now, and not all of it comes from the climate. There's a lot of injustice in the world that I think is really linked to the problems that we are facing as a biosphere crisis. There's a lot of pollution that is killing people. I grew up as a victim of the Green Revolution in South America, and my body has suffered the effects of glyphosate and much worse pesticides and herbicides as I was growing up. So the climate is perhaps just calling us to a time of possibility where we can actually create a really beautiful world that is there and that many people are actually part of, but seems to be running ahead of us somehow. And I loved as well that Vandana mentioned the wisdom that is there in so many places in the world, in so many cultures that still retain that connection with the earth. I was on Saturday part of what we called Friday and Saturday, what we call the Sunset Assembly, where we went around the world listening to different groups of people who can't be here in the COP26, but still have a voice and have a really big role in being part of the ecosystem and preserving the forests and the deltas and so many parts of the world. And what I heard time and again in these different parts, in Africa, in South America, in West Papua, in Australia, in New Zealand, was how I mean the Northern Hemisphere developed model, how we are interfering with their life in a way that prevents them from actually saving their forest, their medicine, their livelihood, and how our efforts to bring conservation everywhere very often end up removing people from their forests so that we can have plantations. And it's heartbreaking, and it's also full of potential and possibility because the solutions are there, I believe. So during the COP, I want to bring what's happening outside, what's happening with the stories of people, because I believe that it's a time for an and strategy. So we need everything that you've all mentioned. We need those changes at the institutional level, at the financial level, and we also need the change that has been happening already about the people doing things differently. So I want to bring stories of people that are part of this place, people that are coming from far and have their hopes and their change that is happening now. And I'm sure it's going to continue happening after the COP, no matter what we agree. We have a lot of agency, and it's my mission to try to find where are those parts of our lives where we have the agency to choose health and regeneration and community. So that's where I'm going to be focusing on. And again, Jim and everybody who's come up with this beautiful project, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Dita. Thank you for bringing in such a soft presence and so heartfully stated out of your own experience the reality of suffering now in the world that needs to be ameliorated with the same urgency with which we need to be working on climate change to prevent future suffering. So that's an important thing to bring in, and we look forward to your reports from the citizens' actions. And in fact, this Saturday and Sunday is going to be when most of the citizen activity will be taking place. So Dita will be back along with Osprey Oriole Lake, who was really wanting to be part of this opening. She's flying into Glasgow today. Her plane was a little late. Osprey, like Dita, is a woman that on the front lines of women empowerment, actually in Osprey's case, through the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. She empowers Indigenous women all over the world that are on the front lines of climate justice. Osprey sent a short 4-minute video in case she couldn't make it today. She was at the United Nations General Assembly room just this last week, and she was asked to give a brief statement about the COP coming up. So Georg, if you could put Osprey's video on, we'll listen to that, and then we'll turn to John Raymer and others.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's truly an honor to stand in this great hall and speak with you today on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. Thank you. True hope is built upon honesty and action, and it's quite straightforward what I have to say today. We are not willing to die. We are not willing to die because corporations and governments tell us that they are doing everything that they can to address the climate crisis, yet emissions continue to rise, as other speakers have said. We are not willing to die because of the insistence upon endless economic growth and extractive industries that particularly harm women and Indigenous, Black, Brown, island nations, and Global South peoples. No, it's not okay to tell us that we are being unreasonable with our demands for climate justice because we don't understand what is possible in the political sphere or the business goal of financial institutions. We say back, you don't understand the laws of physics, and that we will not allow for sacrifice people or sacrifice zones, or corporate colonialism, or incremental transitions to renewable energy, or false solutions like carbon offset schemes instead of stopping pollution at the source. We are not willing to die because those with political power and wealth are having a difficult time understanding that everything is already changing. Mother Nature has made that perfectly clear. I live in California, where year after year now, we are facing catastrophic fires. My lungs and those of many are damaged, or we have lost loved ones to climate-fueled flames. Lives gone forever. I stand before you to offer a call to action that was recently delivered to governments during the UNGA by the Global Women's Assembly for Climate Justice. It's a call to action from women and feminists around the world representing millions of people, outlining in explicit detail what can be done to meet the 1.5-degree target with already existing climate justice frameworks. And I submit this to the offices here. We included both governments and financial institutions in our recommendations because we are well aware of the power of the fossil fuel industry in these two sectors. 60 of the largest banks in the world have collectively financed $3.8 trillion in fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement. And the recent report by the UN Environment Programme found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. How can we approach COP26 with these impossible numbers? Hope means no more rhetoric without copious amounts of action. So the question is, where are the government leaders willing to stand up to the fossil fuel industry? And where is the $100 billion a year promised from wealthy countries so we can move toward a just transition? We can move billions once we claim a global climate emergency, trillions. And pulling from military budgets is a good place to begin. I find my deepest hope and courage in civil society, especially with women leaders. We are in the streets, in the fields, in the boardrooms, and in the halls of power. We are putting our bodies on the line, some of us getting arrested, criminalized, tortured, and even murdered for standing up for the last of the clean water, the last of the forests, for what we hold as sacred, for the last chance for our climate and a livable future. What is happening now is not only unjust, but it's actually insane. As we head into COP26, please know we are not willing to die or sacrifice future generations for truly pitiful reasons of greed, political power, and hubris. Rather, we are willing to fight, to use our imaginations, innovations, to be alive, to thrive, to be courageous, to be uncomfortable for positive changes, to be bold, and to win. We are willing to endlessly fight for policies that prioritize social, racial, and economic justice and Indigenous and human rights. The real problem is not that we don't have a plethora of solutions, from agroecology to Indigenous knowledge, from regenerative energy to feminist economics and climate policies. Rather, the problem is the insistent structural interference that those in power are exercising in response to people taking real action. In the face of this, we are rising all over the world and growing stronger. We can act now, and we must act now. Let's totally break business as usual at COP26 and create the healthy and just world we know is possible. That is hope. Thank you for hearing these words. Please let them pierce our hearts with courage so we can fight together for our collective survival. Thank you.
That was Osprey Oriole Lake at the UN last week. She'll be appearing probably tomorrow and over subsequent days, and particularly over this next weekend. She's involved, as Dita and Rupert and others, in some of the direct action and public manifestations that'll take place, as they always do, during the COP. We'd like to now broaden the conversation because, as I said at the very beginning, we see this as a global dialogue, and we're trying to bring in different facets of human caring during this critical time in human history. So I'd like to bring in now John Raymer. One of the reasons why this broadcast is going out globally to so many thousands of people is because of the SIGN network and because of the partnership that we've had from the very beginning of Humanity Rising with John Raymer and a network of now 300 to 400 organizations that come together and share their Facebook feeds and YouTube and various other ways of disseminating events such as ours today globally in a collaborative spirit of higher unity. So John, I want to thank you for everything you've done to help nurture and support Humanity Rising. He's been intimately involved in the distribution of our 12-day program this week and is one of the most extraordinarily beautiful men that I know. So John, welcome.
Thank you, dear brother. My gosh. I sit here in awe, grateful to you and the vision of a global regeneration corps in this moment. But I'm also challenged. I know that there's a hope that somehow the political leaders are going to finally figure this out, and I know that's not the solution, at least for me. I know the only thing I can do is with us, right here, right now. This frustration of blah, 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 more talk, I can't tolerate it in my space. Therefore, I'm inviting us to write a story over this next 12 days. That we come out at the end unlike anything we have imagined coming into this. To discover something we do not know that can actually make a difference here. We're not lacking the knowledge. We know why, we know what. We have some of the most brilliant people in the world. Oh my God, to sit here and listen. But we haven't come together. Just hearing like Martin's got planned for Stockholm. I don't want to ignore important announcements like that and not find a way to link up. To know that Dr. Kurt Johnson is sitting here with the knowledge and the network that he has, and to think somehow all these parallel streams are going to be flowing by each other, but not weaving with each other. It was a joy to share this on 60 pages this morning. We've got to take what we have and turn it into what we need. Therefore, we need to relate to each other different. Awareness alone is not enough. It's that commitment and that follow through in our commitments that's going to make the difference. And I believe we're capable of that. I'm willing to figure out what I need to do to change in order for things to be different. And I want to invite that conversation. Reach out to me. Let's reach out to each other. Let's have it that on the 13th day, it looks so different than it looks right now. This is the opportunity that I woke up for. I want to see history in the making. I want to be a part of writing that new story that weaves us together, that actually takes all this genius and combines it in ways that actually empower us and our future generations. I'm honored, Jim, to be a part of this. I'm willing to be called out. I'm willing to discover my blind spots. I'm willing to discover what I'm missing. I'm willing to put it all on the table. I mean, this is it. If not now, when? It's been said already enough times. This is the moment. Therefore, with whatever capabilities I have, consider them yours. Tell me how we can take what I have and make what you're doing stronger. I want to figure that out. I want to solve that Rubik cube that actually brings us together in a way that makes a difference unlike any other difference we've ever made before. For me, that's the opportunity. That's why I was so eager to be here. That's why I'm not going away. That's why I'm inviting anyone to reach out. If you've got something doing that I need to know about, that I can bring our incredible network of social innovators that are committed to behavior change at scale, to force, I'm ready to do it. Nothing is more important. It's never been more urgent. Thank you again. May peace prevail on earth. Now's our time.
Thank you, John. You embody the generosity of spirit that has inspired us from the very beginning of Humanity Rising. So I just want to acknowledge you and the Sign Network and all the people and organizations you have interwoven with Humanity Rising as we've evolved over the last 18 months. We're deeply, deeply grateful.
I am so blessed. Thank you, Jim.
We want to now turn to Kosha Joubert, who was with the Global Eco Village Network for many, many years, now is working with Thomas Hübl in the whole domain of trauma, cross-generational trauma, has taken up the Pocket Project as executive director. Kosha has been part of Humanity Rising on a number of occasions. So Kosha, just want to say hello and thank you for joining us. And because I think the perspective that Kosha and Thomas Hübl are bringing in to this whole complexio is another fractal that we need to consider as we come to understand just how complex our current reality is. Kosha?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's also wonderful to meet so many friends, people that I've known for a long time, and also new people here. Really rich. Thank you, Jim, for bringing us all together. Yeah, and as you say, the line, and I think Dita really started bringing some of this in about the grief rituals, and it's a really good question about why are we not crying more? Looking at the world, looking at the state we're in, it's looking at the suffering that is here right now. Yeah, and the Pocket Project is dedicated to restoring the fragmentation that we're currently seeing in the world. So you could say the other side of the coin of Humanity Rising, restoring fragmentation, Humanity Rising. And, what we ask ourselves is, the information is out there. It's been out there since the 60s, as you started in your opening. We've known about climate change. We've all seen the destruction of nature in our lifetimes. In the past 10 years, I've traveled and worked in 48 countries, and I have seen a massive destruction that has pierced my heart and that my body hasn't been able to fully digest. It's been so painful. And I think that is just one aspect of, as we truly start cleaning up our act as humanity, we need to clean up on the inside and on the outside equally. And at the moment, our eyes are very often attracted by the outside world and the solutions we need there. And there is a lack of efficiency in the way we work because there is so much grit, so much sand in the system. And yeah, what we see is that if we look back in humanity's history and we look at the amount of pain and suffering that has been accumulating in our nervous system, in our genes that are passed on from generation to generation. And this has been proven now through epigenetics, how the trauma of the ancestors gets passed on to the next generation. So this cleaning up of all those places where humanity has transgressed against sacred law, the law that is there to protect life, not property, distinguishing those, the lines of undigested cruelty and pain that have been committed against women in gender-based trauma, against people of color, where race was created and race-based trauma has been inflicted over centuries, colonialism, genocide of peoples around the planet, and ecocide, which is one part of climate change. So when we look at these cruelties and we feel how they are clogging up our nervous systems, and we've just started as cultures for the past just over 100 years looking at the impact that individual trauma has on how we can live our life. And I think it's time to look at the impact that individual, ancestral, and collective trauma have on how we can respond to the needs of the world at this time. So if we're still telling the narratives, the stories of the good and the bad, if we're still asking ourselves, what is wrong with them? Rather than looking at what happened to all of us for us to be in this place as humanity, what happened to us, and how can we bring compassion to each other, to the situation that we find ourselves in, and how can we start directly addressing the deep pockets of trauma that are needing to be melted and integrated for us to free up our full potential. So how can we melt the ice in our hearts instead of the ice caps? And together with Thomas, we're developing collective trauma integration processes and bringing together the presence of people in global social witnessing events to look much more directly at that shadow material that we all carry with us, and also at the power of trauma-informed leadership for effective transformational work. And this is our contribution to this story that we are weaving together. And I warmly invite you also, we have a whole stream of events that will be woven in and out of the Humanity Rising events. And I'll be here at COP26, bringing these stories to the floor. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kosha. Look forward to your interventions over the coming days. The point that you're making with Thomas could not be more important. The world is groaning with trauma, with unresolved trauma. You see it all around us, made even heavier by the pandemic. So how we understand that and work our way through it is one of the most critical aspects of getting to the resolution that we so desperately seek. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you in the coming days. I'd like to now introduce Rick Ulfig. Rick is the founder of We the World and 11 Days of Global Unity that he's been convening each year since 2004 between 9/11, September 11th, and International Day of Peace, September 21st. So Rick, like Humanity Rising and others, represents a whole coalition of groups and has a very deep passion for climate justice. So Rick, welcome. Take a few minutes to just make a representation that you would like.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, and your entire team, and Humanity Rising, Ubiquity University, for all of your special coverage over the coming 12 days of the Glasgow Climate Summit. It's been really inspiring listening to all the speakers, and I'm just honored to be here with everyone. And just a little bit about We the World. We the World at we.net is a global coalition building organization with 11 campaigns for change that range from environment with our climate collaboratory to economic justice, women, human rights, disarmament, and peace. Over 600 organizations have stepped up to collaborate with us on one or more of these campaigns. And for us, this is the power of we, people and organizations working together to transform our society. And as John Raymer and everyone was saying, we really need to create an unprecedented coalition, cooperation, coordination of these groups. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to turn this around, what's going on with the climate crisis. So in terms of what is at stake, which is the theme that we're talking about today for this summit, well, the theme of COP26 is about keeping average global temperature rise from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. And from a sheer communication point of view, I think there's a major problem with using that as the main kind of expression point. The problem with expressing it in this way is that in order for humanity to effectively address this climate emergency that we're facing, the communication we use is crucial in order to engage public support and build political will. So talking about global temperature rise, 1.5 degrees or 2.5 degrees Celsius doesn't really mean anything for the average person who sees greater fluctuations every day in their own lives. So it doesn't explain the melting of the polar ice caps to the ordinary person. It doesn't explain the heating of the oceans, the droughts, the wildfires, the extreme weather. So I want to repeat something that I heard Bill Mckibben say the other day in an interview. He was talking about this communication issue, and I want to tell you his way of describing the amount of heat that humans are generating. And I think this is the way I would like to see people talking about what's going on with our climate. This is what he said. The amount of extra heat that we trap every day on this earth because of the coal and oil and gas that we've burned, and this is every single day, is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. Now, to me, that captures what's going on with the planet, why the polar ice caps are melting, and all of these things that we're seeing. 400,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions every day. Imagine that. So watching the Glasgow Climate Summit, and as the world, the news is covering this, and all around the world, we want to make sure the United States does its share. And so I'm going to be talking about this later this week as well, but I just wanted to mention, At this crucial moment, when national green jobs and infrastructure plans in the USA are meeting so much opposition, and the levels of political polarization in the US are so extreme and restraining progress on climate and other crucial issues, some of us are working to launch something called We Power America Renewable Energy Media Campaign and Movement. It's designed to engage multiple movements, shift political discourse towards we and the common good, and actually mobilize at least 2 million people to accelerate the transition that we all want to renewable energy-based society in the United States and around the world for a livable future. So to learn more about this, you can go to we.net/WPA for We Power America. And, I'll be saying more about this in the coming days. You can learn more about We the World and get involved with us by going to we.net. So thank you again, Jim and Humanity Rising and everyone watching this for what you're doing for peace, sustainability, and transformation in our fragile world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure working with you over these months, and we wish you all the best in your new endeavor. That site from Bill Mckibben is quite extraordinary. 400,000 Hiroshima bombs every single day is, like Martin Palmer was saying, that's an image. That's a story in and of itself.
It is.
That can move you far more effectively than a pie chart. So thank you.
Right, or 1.5 degrees Celsius and going to 2 or 3 degrees. I mean, the average person, right?
Yeah. So thank you. We want to now turn to Ash Pachari. He's the son of Rajendra Pachari, the founder of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who won with Al Gore back in 2009 the Nobel Peace Prize. And Ash has followed into his father's footsteps and has been mobilizing young people all over the world to take climate action. So Ash, just take a few minutes and just wanted to welcome you and acknowledge you and your family and your father at this moment. So just take a few minutes and share with us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Jim. I want to start by conveying my gratitude to you, to Humanity Rising, to Ubiquity University for the incredible opportunity and for hosting this brilliant session today. And I just want to say that, the session in itself, the talk, the discussions, and the important speakers whom I'm so grateful to be together with and so humbled to be together with, represent diversity. And I just want to say that I know several of our amazing speakers have already talked about this, but the most beautiful thing that I think we have is the ability to embrace diversity. And today's discussion here exemplifies that. And I want to say that I want to start also by sharing a quote by Mahatma Gandhi, which says, "We have enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed." And I think that, if we can keep this message and this quote really close to our hearts, and I think the reason that we're confronting the challenges that we are is because, there's this world we live in, which is focused on more of, more need and greed and constant more, and at any cost. And I don't think that we're paying attention to those costs. And I think what we need really is a major departure away from these so-called values to really actually the way that you started out our meeting today, which is looking inward, understanding the importance of the consciousness that we embrace, the love, the values, and looking at the indigenous wisdom, the wisdom that has guided us on a path till we sadly departed from that path. But, if you think about it traditionally, a long time ago, indigenous communities that have fed off earth, as do we, but there was a big difference. And the difference is that permission was sought even before plucking an apple off a tree. And I just want to say that there is a great power in that love and that respect. And I know the messages that have been shared here profoundly echo exactly that. And I think that, our spending a few minutes to be aligned with that message is key. And I think that it also is born out of the fact that, we must see each other as a universal family. And that means embracing and living and breathing and keeping close to our hearts and our being, love, respect, compassion, and empathy. And I know that in all the work that you do, you focused on really amplifying the understanding, the practice of this. And I hope that we'll be able to do that. And I just want to say, one of the things that we feel very, very strongly about at the POP movement, where POP stands for Protect Our Planet, is that, we need to embrace the right consciousness and mindset and the values. And in that embedded is that education and knowledge is key. And we want the youth of the world to be inspired by that knowledge, and that knowledge and coming together as citizens of the world. And when I say youth, we're focused on youth, but we must understand that youth also have the ability to influence change at home and in schools and universities and communities. And so really it is about everyone. And we do need that movement. And if we think back on history, it's been when people, a handful of them with the conviction and those values, have come together, and the course of history has changed. And it has been about sharing narratives. At that time, it was about sitting around a fire and sharing our stories. Today, we're blessed to connect with many different parts of the world using a tool and technology like Zoom. But I think the important thing is that we really do share our stories, amplify our voices, and bring our hearts, minds, and souls together, and do that in a manner that we're truly participatory. And I just want to say, through our work, really, we believe very strongly. One is we have to be inclusive. It has to be about everybody. And it has to be with our hearts. But also, very importantly, it has to be ground up. And so we're dependent upon participatory approaches where we can have grassroots movements. And, there is no stopping. When we have people amplifying their voices, sharing their stories, and coming together, we know that there's no turning back after that. And so really the POP movement is about embracing that diversity, but celebrating that diversity and coming together and amplifying our voices. And it is about being ground up, because as they say, when you teach a man to fish, he'll feed himself for a lifetime. And really what we need today is a people's movement. And for us to understand that we are nature. And with that, I just want to convey my thanks, because I think today's session has not only exemplified, but a great celebration. And I hope we can build on this throughout the next 12 days, which are the first days of the rest of our lives, forever and ever. And so with that, I just want to say namaste, which literally means a prayer from my heart to yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ash, and we look forward to a robust relationship between our Global Regeneration Corps, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and the POP movement. There's lots of synergies that we can explore together. So we'll be in touch on that and look forward to hearing from you over the next couple of days. We want to now hear from Kurt Johnson, who's been very actively involved in the ecumenical movement with the United Nations, as a publisher, as an activist, as an evolutionary leader. So Kurt, just take a few minutes. We're wanting to start to wind this up now and hear from our conveners of the various themes over the next couple of days. But Kurt, just take a few minutes to share your perspective.
Great, Jim. So thank you so much. And so I'm actually speaking from one of the other hats that I wear, and that's my 25 years at the American Museum of Natural History and Ecology and Evolution. And in that capacity, I get to work very closely with Dr. E.O. Wilson at Harvard and Dr. David Sloan Wilson at State University of New York on the underpinning in the science in evolution and ecology that's underneath all of this. And so if I keep harping on this throughout the 12 days, it's basically because some of this science is so new that many people don't know about it. Some of this is only mainstreamed in sociobiology since, let's say, around 2015. And here it is really quick. There are three kinds of natural selection that are governing the way that nature is working. And the two new ones that we know about actually buttress the view that's been made by everyone here today, from Andana to Alden to everyone, that nature is going in this direction that serves the whole. It explains the balance of nature in the first place. So the type of natural selection we've all known about is the old Darwinian one, in which the best competitor is the definition of fitness, and that's the one that's chosen and wins out. That dominates all of our economics, all of our business, everything that's going on globally that we're trying now to get around the problems it's created. The other two kinds of natural selection that we've really only known about since the supercomputer era, since 2015 or so, are group selection and multi-level selection, which is groups of groups. Now, these supersede the old Darwinian idea of natural selection and replace them, and they do not choose for the best competitor. They choose for the best cooperator and for a movement toward the evolution of altruism. So what I'm also saying is that's really only in the last 7 years that we've understood how altruism evolves. And an understanding that it evolves through the group selection and the multi-level selection in nature, we understand that actually nature itself is trying to evolve toward a planetary altruism. So to wind up, obviously, as everyone else has said here, what's standing in the way is our species, Homo sapiens, that makes these incredibly pathological behavioral and other decisions that stand in the way of the movement of nature toward the good of the whole. So I'll be harping on that, through the whole week. But if you want to call in the science to buttress the view from the wisdom traditions and the heart that we're evolving toward a planetary altruism, that now is mainstream. Darwinian natural selection is superseded by group and multi-level natural selection, which always select for the good of the whole and drive the evolution of cooperation and altruism at a planetary level. So keeping that in mind, nature is right with us. We're not just operating and making our bad decisions in a vacuum. So Jim, thanks so much. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Kurt, for bringing that point in. It's so fundamental that cooperation, particularly at this moment, is far more efficacious and important than competition. That's what we need to be embracing to further the evolution of humanity on this precious planet of ours. So look forward to your remarks over the next days. We want to conclude our program today, everyone, and we know that this has gone longer than usual, but what we wanted to do was create a collage, a kaleidoscope of all the different perspectives and groups and domains that are coming together in the COP over the next 12 days. And what we've done just to make some sense of all the complexity is that each day we're going to be taking a different theme. So we're going to have very brief comments because you're going to hear a lot more from them, but we just wanted to bring them in to this opening session. And first, we'd like to hear from Ed Mueller. He's one of the founders of Humanity Rising. He was the one who brought in Regeneration, helped craft the Masters in Regenerative Action that we introduced several months ago. Has been one of the co-founders of the Global Regeneration Corps that we'll talk about in a moment. He's convening 4 sessions out of the 12 So Ed, thank you, and just deep gratitude for everything that you've done to bring us to the present time.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for your words. And I'll be very short, but we've heard enough bad stories. We know the problem. I always say this is the best scientifically documented planetary extinction. We know all the science, why we're going to go extinct, and we're not doing anything about it. And if we keep on doing this thing the same way, we won't change things, really. And Buck Fuller said, it's useless to fight these systems. We just have to build a better system that will make the old one obsolete a lot quicker. And I think that's what I'm trying to bring to these 4 sessions. Tomorrow, we see how life started on the planet, how the planet, what Vandana said, reversed the CO2 levels that didn't allow for life. And actually, the soil and the fungi and the bacteria, life in soil is the future. And that should be the first main discussion in the COP. And it's just barely in there. And it's taken 29 years to get the discussion of live soils and carbon capture. And it's actually not a lot of the science that's behind it that allows us to really have a huge potential. It's basically an unlimited potential. Soils have grown forever if they're given the chance. So we'll be discussing with organizations like the Carbon Underground. We have Tom Newmark, we have Larry Coppold, and then also from Savory Institute, we'll hear the role of cattle. And then we have Mel Landers, who's going to be bringing us a tremendous amount of wisdom from indigenous agriculture, regenerative agriculture. So we can actually reverse climate change over the next decades if we just look at changing the way we produce food. And so that will be tomorrow's session. Then we have a beautiful session with the Earth Charter. They're actually now developing an index for countries and their impact on the planetary well-being. So countries will have to account for what is their impact on planetary well-being. I won't go into more detail, but it's a beautiful idea. It's not just one more index. It's actually something that can help us as a population change our view of what really true development is. Then we have a session on oceans, and we know, for example, that if you want to restore a reef, bring sharks back. If you want to plant corals, there are many ways to do it. We can do it by selecting those corals that have survived heat events, that have survived acidification. And we're just trying to gain more time for us to actually reverse the planetary damage and then bring life back to the oceans. And the last session is about biodiversity, which is actually the major point that's now on the table that should be in the discussions at the COP2. Biodiversity, and it was mentioned several times today, it's at really critical limits, tipping points, where we're going to lose the ability to regenerate anything if we just keep on destroying it. But instead of just talking about biodiversity and its problems and extinctions and things like that, I'm going to bring some really impressive success stories of how companies and communities are bringing life back to the planet by doing productive things. So this is, for me, a highlight session where some of these friends of mine that really are making changes on how to behave as a company and make money, but have a positive impact in society and a great positive impact in bringing biodiversity back to life. So looking forward to these sessions. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Ed. Ed's the founder and CEO of the University of International Cooperation and the founder of Regenerate Costa Rica, and has been very actively involved in the biodiversity development over the last several decades. So Ed, thank you so much. Look forward to your session tomorrow and over the next days. We want to now turn to Marilyn Hamilton. She's one of the other pillars of the Masters in Regenerative Action and Humanity Rising and our Global Regeneration Core. We're really building it around bioregions and cities. Marilyn is the founder of Integral Cities Meshworks and has been working tirelessly and with great effect in enabling cities around the world to regenerate during our time. So Marilyn, say a few words about your session.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks everyone else. It's so inspiring to be here. I imagine that cities can be Gaia's regeneration hubs. I too am inspired by James Lovelock. He said that humans are Gaia's reflective organs. And I think the cities are the organs, our organizations are the organelles, and people are our cells in the cities. So I see that we can take all the intelligence that we've been talking about, and it is likely that Ubuntu, that our we space, that our togetherness that is natural in cities is going to be possible to create the conditions where we can bring together people, politicians, and practitioners. And on the panel that I'm going to host, we will have Monica Sharma, who has spoken a great deal about this. And with her over 20 years in the UN, she has been working at leadership and capacity building. She has so much to share that's very practical in ways that have actually been not only with the biodiversity and looking at climate change, but influencing over 20 organizations right now who are working with radical transformational leadership. I spoke of IPCC. Well, we have one of the authors of the IPCC report, and that is Dr. Colleen Vogel, who is with the she is a professor of the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and also leading the climate file for Johannesburg. And we're also practical in looking at how do we implement all of these things. Duncan Crowley, who is co-president of EcoLease and the organizer of Urban Arena Europe, who I've been working with for the last 2 years, has discovered it's not just sustainability and social justice. As Jim has said, sustainability isn't sufficient anymore. And so this whole group of European cities came to the conclusion that it was regenerativity that needed to be fostered, and have come up with 17 keys of ways to do this. We will also bring in something else very practical, and that's donut economics. I've seen it in the chat. It's been a question as why aren't we talking about this practical way to change cities by bringing in the donut economics approach to creating the conditions of social justice within the constraints, the natural constraints of Earth that Vandana spoke about and that Vita spoke to. So we'll have Lenora Graveccia, who is the Cities and Regions' new assigned person in donut economics, to talk about that. So we will have a very full and interesting exploration of cities as Gaia's regeneration hubs when we meet next week.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's always so inspiring to hear from you. I love the notion of cities as regeneration hubs for Gaia. It's a beautiful, beautiful image. Thank you so much. Now, Stephanie Mines, who's a neuroscientist who will be convening the panel on health and climate justice, and is the founder of Climate Change and Consciousness. Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everyone. I am really here as a mother and a grandmother. And when we ask what is at stake, what is really at stake is the future of our children. We are, I believe, facing a new definition of genocide, and that is the obliteration of the futures of our children and the children of the future. I am a dedicated believer that underneath the shock and trauma that I have investigated throughout my career, there is, and I have demonstrated this in my research, an incredible regenerative nervous system that lives in all of us. How do we access that? How do we find at the grassroots level the healthcare resources that do what apparently was not done in Rome at the G20 meeting, truly address the issue of climate and health. I've assembled what any intelligent scientist would bring together, a group of women who really know what health is and what it means to be mother bears for our children. Vandana Shiva speaks so eloquently of biodiversity. She will speak in this panel of the biodiversity within the human ecology and how we can tap into that compassionately, holistically, in our communities, in our families, and in ourselves. Shamini Jain, who is a brilliant scientist of biofields. Biofields are the energy systems that operate within us. They're put to use in industrialized medicine through X-rays and MRIs, but we have that same capacity within our own bodies. So Shamini Jain, Dr. Shamini Jain will address that topic on our panel. Claire Willocks, who is an OBGYN in Glasgow, who has worked with me for many years now on the importance of serving mothers and babies in the prenatal and immediate postnatal time, how we protect the health of our babies, and how we return the birthing process to its natural functions that would sustain that resilient nervous system, which is our birthright. I am also so pleased to include Woman Stands Shining, Pat McCabe, who speaks from the Native American perspective about the true meaning of health and our relationship to the earth as our major source of well-being. This will be on November 4th, Code Red for Health Justice. And I want to add that in that program, I will also be sharing with you the incredible regenerative young people from Africa that have been working with climate change and consciousness. Their projects, they actually mirror very much what Ed talks about in his Regenerate Costa Rica. So I want to be sure to connect these young people with Ed, because they are doing literally with their bare hands in their communities in Africa, the regenerative work of restoring a desertified land and a desertified culture. And I am really thrilled that you will have the opportunity to meet these courageous young people who I'm hoping will be one of the first Global Regeneration Corps pods. I'm a champion of this global regeneration concept that Jim has launched. And I look forward to seeing everyone on November 4th.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much. Stephanie's been one of the prime movers of the Global Regeneration Corps with Ed and Marilyn and others. So I just want to acknowledge you, Stephanie. And now we want to conclude our program today with what is really our offering through Humanity Rising and the coalition that has come together by speaking a bit about the Global Regeneration Corps, which has really naturally emerged as a response to Code Red. We'll be talking about the Global Regeneration Corps every day, so we'll just touch on it right now. But to do so, I want to introduce Leslie Southwick Trask, who is our Chief Development Officer here at Ubiquity University, who's really been one of the prime movers and coordinator of the Masters in Regenerative Action, as well as the GRC. So Leslie, thank you. Let's introduce the Global Regeneration Corps. And again, everyone, we've heard briefly from many people today, and we wanted to do that in our opening, and then in different combinations, intermixed with the themes of each day. We'll be really weaving a tapestry of perspectives and voices over the next 12 days. And we'll be speaking each day about the Global Regeneration Corps. But Leslie, thank you for joining. And why don't you give us our final voice for today's program?
Thanks, Jim. I just want to first say that I'm coming from the traditional lands of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and Treaty 7 peoples, because Mother Earth has been evolving through time in a number of different ways with a number of different inhabitants. And I happen to live on some traditional lands here in Calgary, Alberta. You know, I went through a whole litany of emotions over the last 2 hours from 2.5 hours. How long has this been? Just going from, you know, elation to despair to, okay, we can do this, to can we really do this? And I think that, you know, we need to take a breath and a pause. And as we take that breath and a pause, ask the question, who am I in this vast sea of change initiatives? Where do I fit in to all these movements, to all of these actions? Gets a bit bewildering in terms of where do I start in my place on the world? And we're attempting to answer that question in twofold ways. I've put into the chat the link to joining, taking action through conversation and through involving yourself in the Global Regeneration Corps. So you go to the website, globalregenerationcorps.com, and see where you can take action as an individual, as an organization, or join the conversation, which then links you into Ubiverse, where all of us are meeting to be staying in conversation around this. And where do we fit in this landscape? The one that's really so simple and elegant and fun is the hive. And so today, if you click on the link in the chat, you'll go and create your hive. Over the course of the next 12 days, I will be showing who's joining the hive around the world. We have a goal of thousands to join the hive in the next 14 days. And what this means is that you get to see who else is out there with you. The first step is to create your own hive where you profile who you are in this world. It takes 3 to 4 minutes. It's so short, so lovely and elegant. And then you see your responses. And then halfway through COP26, I'll announce the next functionality, which is where you're going to see how you connect to others around the globe in terms of your challenges, your projects, your networks, and your power and skills. Pretty fun, pretty simple, pretty amazing. So the first step is to create your hive. Do it today. Go on now. And I will be sharing online with Jim the final screen that you will see, which is who is in the Global Regeneration Corps, because that metabolic Earth spinning with all our GRC members will be visible as you complete your hive. So join. Let's see how we can get those numbers in terms of how we're taking action. That's me, Jim.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, Ed, Stephanie, Marilyn, Indra, everyone who's going to be convening theme sessions over the next 12 days. That brings our program on our opening of day 1 to a close. I apologize if we went a little bit longer than we normally do, but there's so many voices and so many passions, I would say, and deep carings that are coming into formation around COP26. We wanted to honor all the voices in giving everyone just a little bit of time as we weave this tapestry. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow for day 2. Ed Mueller will be convening a session on biodiversity and new agriculture and soil sequestration. And again, we'll be having Rupert and Alden and Osprey and different people who are there in Glasgow coming into the program. So we'll be weaving, spontaneously integrating a thread over tomorrow and each day as we combine people's voices from the COP with people's voices globally around various themes that are urgently requiring our attention as we consider climate change. Bye for now. See you tomorrow.
Jim, are you there?